When a homeless man asked Clint Eastwood for just $1, he never expected the legendary actor's life-changing response. It was a mild afternoon in Los Angeles, with the sun's warmth gently balancing the cool breeze. Outside a quiet cafe on Melrose Avenue, a man sat alone at an outdoor table, his sunglasses partially concealing his face. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon. Though age had softened his once sharp features, his unmistakable presence remained. Passers-by stole glances, hesitant to disturb his solitude. Across the street, another man stood unnoticed, his worn, layered clothes revealing a life spent battling the elements. His hair was unkempt, and he clutched a small cardboard sign while nervously fidgeting with his pocket. His name was Kevin, and for the past 3 weeks, he had been sleeping behind a convenience store dumpster. With an empty stomach gnawing at him after 2 days without a full meal, he gathered the courage to cross the street, unaware that his encounter with Eastwood was about to change everything. A relentless reminder of how far he had fallen, Kevin scanned the cafe for someone approachable until his eyes locked on Clint Eastwood. At first, he hesitated. What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? But hunger has a way of stripping away pride. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. His voice was barely above a whisper as he reached the actor's table. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint slowly looked up, removed his sunglasses, and fixed his gaze on Kevin with an unreadable expression. For a moment, Kevin feared he had made a mistake. Then, Clint leaned back in his chair, studying him like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The silence stretched, tightening Kevin's anxiety. Just as he was about to apologize and walk away, Clint finally spoke. $1, huh?" His tone was neutral, but then, with a slight smile, he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." Kevin hesitated. The invitation felt surreal, like a scene from one of the movies he used to watch when life was simpler. Sitting down with Clint Eastwood? It was the last thing he ever expected. Kevin scanned Clint's face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke, but there was no malice, just a calm curiosity that made him feel both exposed and oddly comforted. With a quiet thank you, he eased into the chair across from Clint, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his cardboard sign on the table, angling it to avoid drawing attention. He could feel Clint's gaze, but it wasn't judgmental, it was curious, like someone genuinely wanting to understand the story behind the layers of dirt and despair. Kevin wasn't used to this. Most people avoided eye contact or tossed him loose change without a second thought, unwilling to hear his story. But now, under the steady gaze of someone he never imagined meeting, the words started spilling out before he could stop them. I'm sorry if I bothered you," he stammered, his voice raw. "I don't usually. I don't like asking. I've been trying to find work, but it's hard. Harder than I thought it'd be." He glanced down at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Clint didn't interrupt, he just listened, something most people hadn't done in years. Taking a deep breath, Kevin continued, "The dam breaking. I was a contractor, you know. Had a crew, steady work. Then the recession hit, and the jobs dried up. It didn't take long for the savings to run out. Then came the late notices, and after that," he paused, swallowing hard, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "You can guess the rest." Kevin tried to laugh, but it came out bitter and hollow. "Funny, right? I spent my whole life building other people's homes, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Clint's face remained calm, but his eyes softened. Kevin felt the shame creeping in again and tried to steer the conversation away from himself. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time. I don't mean to be another guy with a hand out. I don't know what else to do anymore." But Clint wasn't the kind of man to brush off a story like that. Instead of reaching for his wallet and politely sending Kevin on his way, he did something unexpected. Leaning forward, he rested his elbows on the table, his hands loosely clasped. The air between them grew heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this moment. Kevin's pulse quickened. He had half expected Clint to hand him a couple of bucks and move on, but instead, Clint asked a question he never saw coming. What's your name? Kevin blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. Kevin, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded slowly, letting the name settle, as if it mattered, as if Kevin mattered. Clint repeated the name, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then, after a pause, he said, "You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of characters in my life, cowboys, soldiers, detectives, and one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story. Good, bad, ugly, it didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to carry it. So tell me this, what's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin stared at him, unsure if he was serious. "The next chapter," he echoed, disbelief in his voice. "Yeah," Clint said, leaning back. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So, what's the next chapter?" A lump formed in Kevin's throat. He didn't have an answer. He hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's a sentence. You need a chapter, a real one, something you can build on." Kevin felt a strange mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about struggle, but something in the actor's voice told him this wasn't just some cliché, it was a challenge. Then, without another word, Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Kevin's heart sank. This was the part where Clint would hand him $1 and send him on his way. But instead of cash, Clint pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go here," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's a shelter run by a buddy of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step." Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Clint's expression softened just a fraction. "Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't." But Kevin wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances, not after everything he'd been through. His fingers hovered over the card as if it were made of glass, fragile yet full of promise. He wasn't sure he deserved it. The name and address printed on it felt like a lifeline, but doubt weighed him down. Could he really trust this? Could he trust Clint? "I don't know, man," Kevin said after a long silence, shaking his head. "I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "People like you? What does that even mean?" Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. "You wouldn't get it. Guys like me, we're just forgotten." Clint leaned forward again, his voice quiet but firm. "You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world and no one's there to help you lift it?" Kevin looked up, startled. Clint's face, though calm, carried the weight of his words. "I grew up dirt poor in the middle of the Depression." Clint continued, "I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow will be any better. And let me tell you something, Kevin, it's not about how hard you fall, it's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you." The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue but found he had nothing to say. Clint leaned back, his tone softening. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this, life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or build you." Kevin felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but quickly blinked them away. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice cracking. "No, it's not," Clint agreed. "But simple doesn't mean easy. It's hard as hell. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been." Kevin stared at the card again, his mind racing. He thought about the nights spent on cold concrete, the meals scavenged from dumpsters, the faces that turned away from him every single day. And now, here was this man, a stranger, a legend, telling him something he hadn't heard in a long time, that he still had a choice. He was worth more than all of that. For the first time in years, Kevin felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name, hope, maybe, or just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded as if that was enough. "Good. That's all I'm asking." But Kevin wasn't the only one changed by this moment. Clint had his own reasons for stepping in, reasons that would soon come to light. Clutching the business card tightly, Kevin stood to leave, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Clint's words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he had buried long ago, of better days, of dreams that once felt achievable. As he took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back. "Thanks for listening," he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Kevin," he said simply before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Kevin didn't see Clint's hand falter slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Clint's jaw tightened for a brief moment, as if holding back a flood of emotion. Sitting alone again, Clint let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Kevin had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he had been reminded of his past, but this time, it hit harder. He had been younger than Kevin when he first learned how quickly life could knock you down. Growing up during the Great Depression, he knew that struggle all too well. Clint had watched his parents struggle to keep food on the table. There were nights when all they had was a can of beans to share between them. Then there were the strangers, neighbors, church folks, sometimes complete nobodies, who stepped in with small acts of kindness that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic, who had offered Clint his first job, a chance to earn a few bucks cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something invaluable, the dignity of work, no matter how small. That man had seen potential in a scrawny kid that no one else did, and it had changed Clint's life forever. Now, decades later, Clint carried that lesson with him. He had built a career most people could only dream of, but he'd never forgotten where he came from or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping Kevin wasn't about charity, it was about giving someone else the chance he'd once been given. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Kevin, but he also knew that sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to spark something bigger. Meanwhile, Kevin walked aimlessly through the streets, lost in his thoughts. The card still clenched in his hand, Kevin passed by shop windows where his reflection stared back at him, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something new. He stopped outside a laundromat, staring at the flickering neon sign. With the little money he had left, he decided to wash his clothes. If he was going to show up at that shelter Clint had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step. And that first step would be the hardest, and most important, one Kevin had taken in years. Kevin's first visit to the shelter was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights, the hurried footsteps, and the steady buzz of voices made him feel out of place. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in, and for the first time in years, Kevin felt like someone actually saw him, not as a problem, but as a person. Days turned into weeks, and though the road wasn't smooth, Kevin began piecing his life back together. The shelter helped him secure a temporary job at a nearby warehouse, where he quickly proved himself to be reliable and hardworking. With the money he earned, he moved into a modest shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head and a step toward stability. Through it all, Kevin thought about Clint Eastwood. He had kept the business card, now worn and creased, as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. One night, after a particularly long shift, Kevin sat down and wrote Clint a letter. He thanked Clint for the kindness he'd shown that day at the cafe and told him about the progress he'd made. Kevin didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like closure, a way to acknowledge the man who had given him a second chance. Months later, Clint received the letter while sitting in his quiet office. He read it carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer where he kept other mementos from his life. For Clint, it was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about paying forward the compassion he'd been shown when he needed it most. Kevin's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he started volunteering at the same shelter that had helped him. He spoke with others who were struggling, sharing his story and offering them the same encouragement Clint had given him. Slowly but surely, he became a symbol of resilience and hope within his community. The café on Melrose Avenue remained a quiet backdrop for countless passers-by, unaware of the life-changing conversation that had taken place there. But for Kevin and Clint, it would always be more than just a meeting. It was a moment that proved the power of human connection, a simple gesture that rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. And for those who hear their story, it serves as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest transformations. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep spreading stories that remind us of the power of compassion and second chances.